Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. We do this show to give you a sense of strategies of citizen power and how you can make change in your community and our country. And over the course of this season, we're going to look at a bunch of strategies that are about changing the game of power, changing the story of power, and changing the equation of power in civic life. Today, we're going to focus on one of these in particular, which is called re-rigging the rules. And I want to spend some time explaining what I mean by that. You know, the nature of power in civic life is for it to concentrate, for it to be monopolized in the hands of a few, and end up yielding a winner-take-all kind of system. Well, in any winner-take-all system, that system depends on rigged rules. And our job as citizens is to understand those rules and to find the tools and the skills and the mindset to re-rig them, to remake them, and to challenge the status quo. That work involves three different dimensions that I want to spend some time talking about here today. The first is being able to see agenda-setting rules. These are the rules that actually just decide what's going to be decided, that set the frame of what is going to be on the table for consideration. The second is this idea of rent-seeking rules. And here I mean something very specific. I'm not talking about rent paid to landlords. I'm using the term the way economists use it, which is to say a way of collecting unearned benefit without adding anything of value to the rest of society. Our economic and political system is filled with rent-seeking rules that have been baked into our tax code and other policy frameworks by special interests. We'll talk more about that. The third dimension, then, is the question of transparency and how you and I and other citizens can shine a light on these often hidden, deeply buried agenda-setting and rent-seeking rules and the tools that we can use to amplify transparency. Let's start with agenda-setting rules. What does it mean to set the agenda? Well, it means to understand the who, the what, and the how of decision-making. The who is simply this: who's authorized to decide? Now, that's something that is said on paper in the first place, that on paper it says that here's a commission, for instance, of unelected people who, at the FCC, for instance, will decide about big mergers between media companies. Or maybe it's a question of elected officials. Here's your member of Congress, your member of the city council, who will vote on different policies that we're debating and discussing. And you can look at this question of elected versus appointed and these different bodies as one layer of the who question. But don't forget these folks here. These folks here in the background are the people who are often behind the scenes, the powers behind the throne, the people who are influencers, senior staff, friends, cronies, family members of either the elected or the appointed folks who are making decisions and are really the conduits of power. For you as a citizen, you've got to be asking yourself all the time, who's in charge? Who really makes the call here? Who has that say, not just on paper, but the way that things really get done and that decisions really get made? And then to apply your pressure as appropriate on the right folks here. The next dimension here then is what gets decided. What's on the agenda? Now, you go to any public meeting, whether it's a city council meeting or a legislative hearing, and you'll get a document that says, well, here are the things that we're going to discuss and debate today. And that agenda is often very full and full of controversy. But we've also got to pay attention to a second thing, which is this: what's not on the agenda? What got X'd out? What got blocked in the first place from even being considered? And why? Was it because it was seen as too controversial and hot by all the decision makers on that body? Or was it just one person who had a lot of clout, who was really motivated to kill this thing, and everybody else didn't feel that strongly about it, right? We've got to be able to see how and why these things often get blocked and killed from consideration on the agenda. But beyond that, there's another dimension too, which is the surrounding context of ideology and language and narrative and belief that surrounds and shapes the agenda. Now, that can be an ideology like white supremacy in the United States, or an ideology like the belief in the perfection of capitalism. But whatever it is, there are all these hidden assumptions that are baked in to our surrounding political culture and political context at any given time. And they shape and put pressure to bear on this agenda. And they, again, determine both the language of what's on the paper and the spaces that hide what's not on the agenda. Well, then we get to this third aspect of agenda setting, which is how decisions get made. And here you have a lot of different rule sets. In some places, it's just majority rule. 50% plus one is enough to get you a decision. In other contexts, it takes a supermajority, 60% or 2/3 on some tax measures or other policies. And in some settings, it's not really so much about the percentages, but it's about some folks having more votes and more voice than others. You think about the superdelegate controversy in the Democratic Party. All of these rule structures, you have to remember, were not handed down by anybody in some pristine way. These are the product of negotiation and conflict and controversy among deciders. Some people on rules committees in each of these bodies decided that it should be 50% plus one, or 2/3, or some people getting more votes than others. We have to, as citizens, be able to see that and to be able to unpack the ways in which these particular rules of decision got rigged. Now, this may seem a little boring to you, it may seem a little technical, and I'll tell you what, the people who are making these decisions count on you being bored. They count on you thinking this is too much detail, and they end up behind closed doors getting to rig these rules of decision in ways that, if we are fully empowered as citizens, we will challenge them. Well, this brings me then to the second big category of rules that we want to talk about here today, and that's rent-seeking rules. As I said earlier, rent-seeking is not about what you pay the landlord every month. I mean rent in the sense of what economists mean when they describe ways in which people oftentimes will just rig a system and game a system to get unearned compounding benefits just for being there. The classic example used in economics is of somebody who lives near a river and decides to extend a chain across that river and allow ships to pass through that river only if they pay a toll. That adds nothing to society. It's just making that one person who happens to live by the river richer. Now, that example is multiplied 1,000-fold throughout our public policy. All of these ways in which people who already have money, already have privilege and voice, use that money and that privilege and that voice to get more and to compound their power. You think about examples like the ways in which the payday loan system works in this country, where low-income people who have low access to credit end up paying exorbitant interest rates in order to get credit. Now, sure, low-income people may be a somewhat higher credit risk than people of greater means, but there's almost no economic, much less moral justification for interest rates like you see that approach 1,000% on payday loans. That is pure rent-seeking. That's people who are lending that money at those rates simply because they can, and they can squeeze it out of people. The same thing is true at the other end of the spectrum with wealthy people and the way in which wealthy people have rigged the tax system in their favor. That's why capital gains are taxed at a much lower rate than actual work. There's nothing magical about that preference. It's just that capitalists have figured out how to use their capital to influence decision makers and the tax code writers to say, you know what, the kind of money we earn just from sitting on stocks and bonds, that should be taxed at a lower rate. No good reason why. That is pure rent-seeking. Well, if we want to understand how we change both agenda setting and rent-seeking rules, we've got to have a commitment to transparency. As citizens, that means we've got to be dogged about unpacking and unlocking the ways in which all of these rules get written and shining a light, not only with our own voice and our own power and our own curiosity, but with the help of the media. You think about the ways in which the press and a free press exists to uncover the ways in which behind closed doors rules get written all the time on various kinds of economic and social policy. Our job as citizens is to be working with the free press always to shine that light and to reveal what's getting hidden about the rigging of the rules. Without that, we don't stand a chance at re-rigging the rules. But with that, once you shine that light of public exposure, the game is completely changed because most of these folks do this stuff in the dark, knowing full well that when it's exposed to sunshine, it is shameful and it is embarrassing. And we can bring to bear public pressure on this kind of rigging. Here in our own community in Seattle, there are so many great examples of rigging of the rules, but one that comes to mind in particular and that we're going to spend some time looking at now in the next segment is about people who have been incarcerated, formerly incarcerated people trying to re-enter civilian and civic life, and realizing all the ways in which the system and the deck are stacked against them, and all the ways in which in employment and other forms, rules are rigged against them. How do they navigate that, and how do they and their champions re-rig those rules? Let's find out.